In 1982, Benedict Allen entered the northeastern Brazilian rainforest as a 22-year-old on his first independent expedition. Months later, after an attack by gold miners, the loss of his supplies, and a long period of isolation with malaria, he walked out alive. For part of that ordeal, the only living companion beside him was a dog that had followed him into the forest. The northeastern Amazon was not dramatic in a single, obvious way. It was vast, humid, and continuous. Rivers ran through it in long brown curves. Rain moved in and out without warning. The canopy closed overhead and reduced distance to something felt rather than measured. A person could travel for days and still have only a partial sense of where he stood within it. This was the region Benedict Allen entered as a young explorer in the early 1980s, aiming to cross a remote section of the Amazon basin in Brazil's northeast. Later summaries of the journey describe it as his first independent expedition and as part of a wider attempt to move through a little-known frontier corridor of forest and river. It was a landscape where routes were rarely fixed, and where movement depended less on a straight line than on whatever watercourse, trail, or local knowledge could be found. To outsiders, places like this are often described as empty. They are not empty. They contain settlements, camps, territories, and histories that may not be visible at first glance. Indigenous communities, river people, traders, and miners all moved through the forest according to their own needs and knowledge. What looked from afar like wilderness was, in practice, a human landscape divided by skill, familiarity, and power. Allen would later say that one of the central lessons of his early journeys was that the forest itself was not the true enemy. More often, danger came from ignorance, isolation, and from other people. At the beginning, though, there was only the setting. Water, mud, insects, silence, and the slow pressure of distance. The Amazon had not yet become a survival problem. It was still a place to enter, to observe, and to cross. Benedict Allen was young when he went into the Amazon. Public accounts place him at 22 during this first independent expedition, though some later retellings date parts of the journey to 1983 because the crossing appears to have run across that period. The broad record is consistent on the important point: this was his first major solo venture into the northeastern Brazilian rainforest, and he was largely inexperienced in the hard practical sense that mattered most there. He had prepared himself in the way many young explorers of that period did. He had read widely, trained his body, and built an idea of exploration from books, science expeditions, and the remains of an older tradition in which remote places were still described as blank spaces waiting to be crossed. He had studied environmental science and had already taken part in field expeditions as a student. What he did not yet fully possess was the slower knowledge that comes only from extended exposure to terrain, weather, and local systems of survival. He later treated this gap with some severity in his own reflections, seeing that first Amazon journey not simply as an adventure but as an education in how little he understood. The expedition itself was long before the crisis began. In Allen's later account, he spent roughly 5 months trekking through the rainforest, moving with help from local people and, at times, being passed from one indigenous group to another. That detail is important. The journey was not a clean solo line drawn across the map by a single man acting alone. Like many real expeditions, it depended on guidance, hospitality, and the presence of people who already knew how to live in the region. Allen would later build much of his career around that recognition, but on this first journey he was still learning it. Somewhere during those months, in a village, he found a dog with an injured paw. He treated it, and the animal began to follow him. The dog remained with him as he continued deeper into the forest. Later retellings often place great weight on this companionship, sometimes turning it into the emotional center of the story. In the historical record, the role of the dog is simpler and more severe. The animal was company in isolation. It helped keep him oriented emotionally when he was alone. It also, eventually, became part of the final calculus of survival. Allen himself stated this directly years later, without trying to soften it. His route took him through a frontier world that was changing fast. In the early 1980s, parts of the Brazilian Amazon were being pushed open by prospectors, road schemes, and extractive activity. The presence of gold miners mattered. Their camps were often tense, unstable places, and outsiders moving through such zones could easily become vulnerable. Allen later wrote that on both this expedition and a later Amazon venture, the greatest threat did not come from the natural world in the conventional sense. It came from opportunists operating at the forest edge of legality. By then, however, he was still moving forward. He had youth, momentum, and the confidence that often carries a person farther than his judgment should allow. The expedition had not yet failed. It had merely become remote enough that failure, when it came, would be difficult to reverse. The crisis began at night. According to Allen's later published account, after months in the forest he encountered gold miners who attacked him. In one version, they came for him in the darkness with knives. He was frightened, young, and badly outmatched. He ran for his canoe. The dog was with him. In the confusion, the canoe capsized in rapids, and he lost everything that had allowed the expedition to remain an expedition rather than become a survival march. That moment was the dividing line. Before it, he still possessed equipment, rations, and a transport route through water. After it, he had almost nothing. Later accounts describe him as fleeing with only what he was wearing, and official summaries of the expedition note that he emerged only after several weeks alone, racked by malaria. In one retrospective article on his return to the same area decades later, he wrote that he had to walk out to the outside world, stumbling on for about 3 weeks and eventually collapsing into daylight some 65 miles to the northeast. Other summaries describe the period more generally as several weeks alone. The exact count in days varies in the retelling, but the pattern is clear. Once the canoe overturned and his equipment vanished, isolation became nearly total. This was the point at which exploration stopped and reduction began. His world narrowed sharply. He no longer had a project, only a direction. No planned traverse, no broad geographical idea, no romantic conception of the forest could help much now. There was only the practical question of whether he could continue walking with so little food, so little protection, and so little certainty about where the forest ended. He was not immediately dying. Many real survival situations do not begin that way. They begin with loss, confusion, and a series of manageable problems that become fatal only when joined together. Allen still had his body, his will, and at least some sense of a bearing. But he had entered a new phase in which every small mistake would accumulate. Exposure, infection, insects, fever, hunger, and navigation would now press on him at the same time. The dog followed him into that new phase. It was no longer simply an adopted animal from a village. It was the only other living being moving with him through the forest. The surviving record does not provide a complete daily log of every camp, every meal, or every river crossing. It gives something narrower and, in some ways, more useful, the outline of how a person remained alive long enough to reach the edge of the forest. Allen moved on foot. That much is constant. Without canoe, with little or no equipment, he kept heading northeast, later estimating that he covered around 65 miles before emerging into cultivated land. In rainforest terms, that is not a simple walk. Distance in the Amazon is deceptive. A mile may include swamp, tangled undergrowth, fallen timber, biting insects, stagnant water, steep banks, and countless delays. Progress can be measured less in miles than in hours of cutting, stumbling, and correcting direction. Navigation would have depended on whatever remained in his memory and on whatever rudimentary orientation he could preserve under physical decline. Allen later referred to following a compass bearing during his return visit decades afterward, but during the original escape, the important fact is not technical precision. It is that he continued to move in a chosen direction instead of circling in panic. Survival in such terrain often begins with discipline rather than brilliance. He had to keep going before fever, weakness, or confusion made sustained movement impossible. At some point during this period he contracted malaria. In his later account, he described having malaria and becoming delirious. In another official retrospective, he wrote that he suffered first one strain and then another. The onset of malaria in the rainforest is especially dangerous because the symptoms do not simply weaken the body. They distort judgment, interrupt rhythm, and make basic tasks harder to sustain. A person who is hungry and physically exhausted may still remain methodical. A person with fever, chills, and delirium begins to lose the mental order on which method depends. That is where routine matters. Even when the record is incomplete, one can infer the broad structure of what he had to do. He had to find water regularly and avoid becoming immobilized. He had to protect enough body heat at night to keep functioning the next morning. He had to manage movement during periods of weakness and continue despite the temptation to remain still. He later described the forest of that time as a dark tangle. That phrase suggests not merely vegetation but the sensory effect of extended immersion, restricted light, restricted horizon, and no clean visual confirmation that effort is leading anywhere. Food was the slowest emergency. Starvation in the forest is deceptive because the surroundings appear alive and abundant, yet much of what grows there is inaccessible, indigestible, dangerous, or unknown to the outsider. Allen would later spend years learning from indigenous communities how to move through remote environments by their methods rather than his own assumptions. On this first journey, he had not yet acquired most of that knowledge. That absence shaped the crisis. He could not simply begin living off the land in any confident, systematic way. He was moving through a region whose possibilities were mostly closed to him. The dog, however, changed the mental structure of the ordeal. Allen later said the animal became incredibly important in keeping his hopes up. They were both suffering, but they were in it together. This is not sentimentality. In many survival accounts, companionship alters endurance by preserving routine and by preventing the total inward collapse that can follow isolation. A person alone in the forest must generate his own reasons to rise, walk, and keep sequence in the day. The presence of another living creature can anchor those actions in a shared pattern. Feed, move, rest, rise. Continue. But companionship also imposes a cost. The dog was deteriorating as Allen deteriorated. He later wrote and said that he knew how bad the animal looked. In his diary, he made a dark drawing of the two of them imagining eating one another. This detail survives because it captures the moment when starvation ceased to be abstract. It had entered thought. Hunger and prolonged survival does not remain a physical sensation only. It becomes a narrowing of options, then a form of reasoning. By then, time had likely become unstable. Later retellings mention 3 weeks after the attack, or several weeks alone, and the title used here frames the ordeal as 30 days lost in the Amazon. In practice, accounts of severe survival often differ slightly in duration because fever, isolation, and retrospective memory do not produce perfect chronology. What matters is not the exact count of days but the length relative to his condition, long enough for malaria, hunger, and delirium to combine, long enough for the dog to become both companion and final reserve, long enough for daylight itself, when it finally opened, to seem almost improbable. He continued walking because stopping was indistinguishable from surrender. Later, on his return to the same area decades afterward, Allen wrote that in youth he had kept going because there was no other choice if he wanted to see his parents again. This is a retrospective explanation, but it is consistent with the mechanics of survival. People in remote emergencies often endure not through abstract courage but through a single simple commitment repeated daily. Go on. Stand up. Keep direction. Reduce the problem to the next stretch of ground. The forest did not assist him in any theatrical way. It did what large environments do. It imposed friction on every action. It made each gain provisional. It concealed edges. It took strength and offered little back. The work of survival, under those conditions, was not dramatic. It was repetitive and diminishing. Fever rose. Strength declined. Food failed. Yet he remained in motion. Eventually the survival problem became singular. Allen later recalled lying on his back one day and thinking that if he did not eat something, he would not get up again. He was starving, sick with malaria, and close to collapse. The dog, which had helped sustain him psychologically, now stood within the logic of that moment as the only remaining source of food. He killed it and cooked part of it using items from a survival kit. In his own later retelling, he did not present this as a revelation or a dramatic turning point. He described it as the last card available to him. This is the hardest part of the record and the part most often simplified by others. It is easy to force such a decision into a familiar structure of guilt, redemption, or spectacle. Allen himself never denied that the act haunted him. He said it drove him for years and remained something he wanted, in some sense, to rectify. But in the context of survival, the significance is narrower and harsher. Starvation had stripped away every non-essential category. There was no audience, no code of conduct preserved intact by comfort, no symbolic meaning to the animal that could outweigh the immediate arithmetic of whether he could rise and walk again. Even then, the outcome was not secure. He later said the food gave him a little strength to keep going, but it also terrified him because he knew he had played his last card. That phrase matters. It means he understood the act not as salvation but as temporary extension. There was nothing left after it. No reserve. No further compromise available. If the forest did not end soon, he would still die there. This is often how real survival crises culminate. Not with heroic expansion, but with the removal of alternatives. A person does not become stronger. He becomes more exact. He continues on a margin so narrow that each hour depends on the previous one having been endured without complete physical failure. Some days later, Allen saw what he described as a chink of daylight. He had been moving through dense darkness for so long that open light itself registered as a change in reality. Soon he stepped out into a farmer's crop. The sequence is abrupt in the surviving account. That abruptness is believable. After long confinement in forest, the transition to cultivated land can be sudden. One step remains within survival, and the next places the body inside another human order entirely: field, boundary, water, house, treatment. A farmer gave him an anti-malarial drink. He was then taken to hospital. Public summaries note that he emerged from the forest after several weeks alone, seriously ill with malaria. No dramatic rescue aircraft, no triumphant reunion at the forest edge. Just a sick young man crossing out of one world into another after reaching the limit of what he could do alone. The end of the ordeal was quiet. Allen did not walk out of the Amazon restored. He walked out damaged, fevered, and dependent on immediate help. Later accounts agree on the essentials. He reached cultivated ground after covering roughly 65 miles on foot, received treatment from a local farmer, and was taken on for medical care. He had survived the isolation, but survival in its literal sense was all that had been secured. When he returned to Britain, he did not at first tell his parents how badly the expedition had gone. The story became public only after he spoke to a local newspaper and the account spread. The public response focused heavily on the dog, and Allen later said he received hate mail, including attention from the RSPCA. This secondary episode matters because it shows how survival stories are often recast once they leave the terrain in which they occurred. What had been, in the forest, a private and terminal calculation became, at home, an object of judgment detached from hunger, fever, and the absence of alternatives. Yet the larger result remained plain. A young explorer had gone into the northeastern Brazilian rainforest with ambition and limited experience. He had been attacked, stripped of supplies, infected by malaria, and reduced to the final practical terms of survival. He nonetheless kept moving until the forest ended. There was no celebration built into that outcome. Only continuation. Allen's first Amazon journey remained central to the rest of his life. He later framed it not as a pure feat, but as a formative mistake that taught him where knowledge actually resides in remote places. Rather than returning again as the outsider who imagines he can conquer a landscape by will, he built much of his later work around learning from the people who already belonged to the environments he entered. The Amazon ordeal changed the method as much as it proved the endurance. That is the quiet significance of the story. A man survived the forest, but not by mastering it. He survived because, even after fear, fever, hunger, and loss, he kept enough order to go on walking until the green enclosure finally broke. The Amazon remained what it had always been, vast, indifferent, and real. What changed was the man who came out of it.